All right, let's take a look at the homework for tonight. So we are supposed to write both a sine and a cosine equation that would produce the sinusoid that we see. And remember, there are a lot of correct answers. So you might have picked a different spot to start the period on your graph to model. So go to Desmos and type in my equations and type in your equation. And as long as they line up perfectly, then you have a correct answer as well. All right. I like to start with the midline. So remember, the midline is the max, which is -1, plus the min, which is -5, divided by 2. You're finding an average of those two extremes. So the midline is through y equals -3. You can draw that in if you want to. I like to draw it in. I think it is a nice visual. And that is so the midline is -3, so that's the d value, right? All right. And then the next thing I like to find is the amplitude. I'm not sure why I didn't put a spot for amplitude on here, but that's okay. We do need the amplitude. So I can see that the amplitude is 2 units because that's the distance from the midline to one of the maximums. Okay, and then period. So you need to mark off one period of either a sine or a cosine curve. So I'm going to say sine because I always like to start on the y-axis if it's a nice sine or cosine curve that starts right there, and just do that. So I can see that the period is pi. And remember, we want to set pi equal to 2 pi over b to figure out what b is. So b is 2 pi divided by pi. So b is 2. And I'm putting frequency on here just to have you practice this, but finding the frequency does not correspond to any of these values. We already have b. The frequency is 1 over pi. I just want to make sure you know that it's that and not 1 over 2. Phase shift is a horizontal shift, and remember, it's different for sine and cosine. For sine, there would be no phase shift. This starts right on the midline, right on the y-axis. If it's cosine, take a look at the cosine curve. You can mark off any period you want. I'm going to do this one. So here's one period of cosine. What is this point right here? Well, it's halfway between 0 and pi over 2. It's pi over 4. Or another way to get how far each tick mark is, maybe this is a good practice to get into. Every point is plotted the period divided by 4. So period divided by 4 every single time. So that's also how I know that this is at pi over 4. And like this point, if I needed it, is at 3 pi over 4, etc. Okay, so the cosine has been shifted to the right, pi over 4. As far as c values go, to go right, you say minus pi over 4. Okay, and we have enough for our equations, so scooch this over. Okay, so let's start with the sine graph. So y equals, it's a positive sine graph, so the amplitude is positive 2. Sine of b was 2, parentheses. I'm going to write in x minus 0, and the midline was -3. So there's the sine graph. The cosine graph. Cosine was also positive because it starts above its midline, so 2 cosine. B will be the same. The period is still 2. We said this is going to be x minus pi over 4, -3. So again, the amplitude will be the same for both. Sometimes you might have one reflected and one not. The period, the value of b, the period calculates the value of b, and that will be the same. The midline will definitely be the same. It's just c that could change. So it's really just a that could be different, positive or negative, and c will be a different number totally. All right, next one. Let's find the midline first. This looks like a max of 2 and a min of 0. Divide that by 2, you get a midline of 1. So that's D. I can also find the amplitude. Amplitude is from the midline, which is here. From the midline to an extreme is the amplitude. So the amplitude is also 1. The period, let's look at the period. So how about this point that I just marked off here? So from -2 pi to 2 pi, what is that distance? That's a distance of 4 pi, and that's equal to 2 pi over b. So b is going to equal 1/2 to make that happen. Now I did that by 2 pi over 4 pi, or we've graphed enough of these that maybe you just remember when b is 1/2, we have a period of 4 pi. The frequency would be 1 over 4 pi, again, just to practice that. What about the phase shift? So I marked off a cosine curve to begin with, so I'm going to start with cosine. Now this cosine curve would normally start on the y-axis, so it's gone left 2 pi units. So that would equate to a c value of plus 2 pi. And then find a sine curve somewhere. So a sine curve can start anywhere. Let's say it starts right here. And then it opens down and back up in here. So this is the sine curve I've marked off. You could have gone all the way over to negative 3 pi, but my sine curve is negative, and it looks like it's gone left pi units. So that c is going to be plus pi. All right, so let's start with our sine curve. So y equals, now take a look at the sine curve you marked off. The one that I marked off that's been shifted the way I said is negative. So negative 1 sine, or you could just write negative sine, of b is 1/2 x plus pi, and then d was plus 1. And then for the cosine curve that I marked off starts above its midline, so it's positive 1 cosine 1/2 x plus 2 pi. Midline was still plus 1. All right. Number 3. We had something like this as the bonus on our quiz, where now the axis is not labeled with pi's. It's not always going to be. This is like 1 radian, 2 radians, 3 radians. So you go about your work the same way. To find the midline, it's 3 plus negative 3 over 2. Or this is one that you might just be looking at and saying, like, yeah, it's y equals 0. So that's the d value, 0. That means that the amplitude from midline to the top is 3, or midline to the bottom. The period, so here's one period we could look at this way. I like anytime I can find a sine or a cosine graph that starts on the y-axis. I like that because the math is nice and easy. I can see that the period is 4. Now, if that's equal to 2 pi over b, solve for b. B is equal to 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. So b is pi over 2. This section was our bonus section. What's the frequency? If the period's 4, the frequency is 1/4. That means that every unit, a fourth of the period is graphed. That's kind of easier to see on this one. Okay, what about sine and cosine? I'm going to start with cosine because that's what I marked off. There is no shift if this is a cosine curve. There is a reflection, but we'll take care of that in a minute. If this is a sine curve, find a section that's a sine curve. I tend to go to the right, I think. So I'm going to look at this section here, but pick any sine curve. There are multiple correct answers. I'm going to say that the sine curve has gone to the right 1 unit. So that's a c value of making it right is going to be minus 1. And we have enough to write our equations. So if we start with sine, y equals, this is a positive sine graph that I'm looking at. So amplitude is 3, and then sine, b was pi over 2 times x minus 1 plus 0. I'm just going to write plus 0 just because I'm not sure how we'll need to do it for AP, but you can simplify that if you want. The cosine curve that I marked off that started on the y-axis, and that's important because I have to go off of what I said the shift was, that's a negative cosine curve, so it's got to be negative 3 cosine of pi over 2 times x, no shift, minus 0, plus 0. Okay, last example. I wanted to put one on here where, again, we didn't have these tick marks to see. So let's first start with midline. Like, don't let the no tick mark thing scare you. So start with the midline. The max is negative 2. Add the min, which is negative 10. Divide that by 2. That's negative 6. Draw that in if that helps you visualize. I like drawing the midline because it's easier for me to find a sine and a cosine graph that way. D is -6. A is half of that distance, right? So from -2, or I'm sorry, A is not half that distance. A is half of the overall distance between the max and the min. I'm sorry. So what we're just looking at is from -2 to -6. A is 4. It's still early. Okay. What else? The period. So this is what we have to tackle. What's up with the period? Because I can see where here's a period of cosine, but I'm not sure how far that is. So what we need to do is say, okay, well, what is marked off? 6. How many periods fit in 6 units? So starting on the y-axis, 1, 2, 3. So this is frequency. There are 3 periods that happen in 6 units. But to know the period, to take the reciprocal of this, we want to know, well, okay, how many in 1 unit then? So divide by 6, right? So if you simplify this, if you say, okay, instead of 6 units, I got down to 1 unit, I divided that by 6. Divide 3 by 6 as well. A half period gets completed every 1 unit. So if you can visualize this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, this section is a half period, which checks out completely, right? That's half of a cosine curve. So that makes sense. Okay, the frequency is 1/2, half of a period per 1 unit. That means the period is 2. And now that we have the period, we can say, well, okay, what's B? B is 2 pi divided by 2, so B is pi for this one. And take note that anytime the axis doesn't have pi's on it, your B value will have to have a pi in it to get the pi to cancel out. And then what about phase shift? So now that we have the period, we can say each point, each tick, whatever, each point is the period divided by 4. So 2 divided by 4. So all of these points, all of these extremes are happening at a half unit away, right? Because we're saying boop, boop, boop. Like here, midline is a half unit. This is 1, 1.5, 2. Okay, so anyway, as far as shifts go, for cosine, there's no shift. It's starting right on the y-axis. For sine, maybe I look at this graph here. Maybe I start it 1 unit over. So that's why I need to know, like, what is this space? Well, it's 1 box away, or 1 tick mark, or 1 point away from the starting point. So sine graph has been shifted right 1/2. 1/2 of a radian, because each box here, each unit is a half unit. That's half, that's 1. That's 1.5, that's 2, etc., all the way out to 6. All right, so what does that mean? That means that C is -1/2. When we write the equations, let's start with the sine graph. So y equals, the sine graph I marked off opens up. So it's 4 sine of pi, parentheses, x minus 1/2, minus 6. For the cosine graph starts down below the midline, so it's -4 cosine pi x minus 0 minus 6. It takes some practice for sure. It's okay if this is confusing. We're going to be doing this for a few days. And so hopefully with more practice, it will get a little bit easier.